one of the things that you might not know that I spent most of my life before coming here, back in the 70s, as a teacher and as a chaplain. And so I just feel more comfortable at a lectern than I do sitting down. So I'm going to stand, if you don't mind. I think a little better. You're sitting in the oldest building in the town. It was built in the 1840s as a large farmhouse for a 15 or 20 acre farm that was located on this side of town. There wasn't much in town back then when this was built. And the farm existed because of the hot springs. And it serviced the very large and popular health spa that was going on in the middle of the 19th century down by the springs themselves, which you'll be visiting, I understand, tonight, I think. Mm-hmm. The springs are the reason that we have a town here. Otherwise, it would just be part of the Pisgah National Forest, I'm sure. History is so much a part of this house and so much a part of our town that I want to talk a little bit about that history. And then I'll try to relate it to the more modern history of the Appalachian Trail, which is one of the newer things that's happened in this town, believe it or not. If you notice coming into town, if you came from Asheville on our main road, which is 2570, there's a historical marker that says Painted Rock on it. 5 or 6 miles down the river, in the official border between the state of Tennessee and North Carolina, is a huge cliff that goes up about 200, 300 feet right beside the French Broad. And it's always had stylized Indian paintings on it, the kind of ones that are found in several places on the East Coast. The archaeologists last year somehow or other recorded the age of these paintings, which are very, very hard to see now, but you can still see them if you know where to look on the face of the cliff. Were supposed to have been done 2,000 years ago or more. They don't know exactly, but they traced the rock and also the paintings, the ink or whatever they use, paint in some sort of way. So this place has been inhabited by Native Americans, and these were pre-Cherokee probably, for a long, long time. Not much is known about those people. In the 1840s, the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto is supposed to have come down the French Broad from what's now Asheville on his way to find gold in the Midwest. He didn't find gold, and then, you may know, ended up dying of some disease down there, what's now New Orleans. But his chronicler, a monk, a Spanish monk, kept a journal every day of what they were seeing and where they were going. And he describes the painted rock, the paint rock, as the locals call it, in great detail and almost exactly the way it is now. So that's the only actual historical evidence that we have that his expedition came through here. But he traveled all around in what's now western North Carolina and some of East Tennessee, as you know, looking for gold. And he had various kinds of relationships with the Cherokee and the Creek. At that place called Painted Rock was the defining boundary between these two very powerful Indian tribes that were in the South, the Cherokees and the Creeks, which are over in what's now Tennessee. And they fought over possession of that rock lots of times. So we don't know much about that. That was 1540. But in 1778, 2 English explorers from somewhere down east, probably Old Fort or Marion, which were already early settlements, came through here, going after supposedly Cherokee horse thieves. And as they rode their horses across the French Broad River down here, they suddenly felt all this warm water in the middle of the French Broad. And they climbed out and started looking around, and they found there was a stream running into French Broad there. It's called Spring Creek. And there was warm water there. They knew something about mineral springs, and so they sort of staked it out on their exploratory maps and called it Warm Springs because the water was warm. A year later, some of them came back and built a very primitive kind of hotel there so that people could come, stay overnight, and take the waters. And that was the beginning of this town and this part of the country, as a fact. And that was 1794. By 1801, to show you how quickly the town developed, there was a post office here and a postmaster and several houses. We don't know how many, but certainly the inn was there. And it began to be a place where people stopped if they were going to settle Tennessee, East Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky. All were settled by people streaming down from the Carolinas and from Virginia and South Carolina through this pass that was created by the French Broad River. Very early on, there was a turnpike in 1827 that was open that was a proper road, as roads were proper back then, it wouldn't be much, but that ran from Greenville, South Carolina, to Greenville, Tennessee. And the coming of that, it's called the Buncombe Turnpike, was like the opening of the interstate nowadays in some places, though, thank God, most of us have stopped being open now. But it changed everything. All of a sudden, there were hundreds, literally, one count said there were 269 covered wagons that came through Hot Springs, going east to fan out over the west, the southwest, and the Midwest, which were the frontier at that point. And then along came Andrew Jackson, as you know, and very ferociously cleared out all of the remaining Indian tribes that were anywhere in southern Appalachia. So all of a sudden, all this land was open for free, for settlement. It was, claimed by the government, but you could get a permit and could get land either free or very cheaply. A lot of revolutionary soldiers were paid off, sort of, when the war ended and America became an independent country, by land grants from the government all around in here. In fact, most of this part of the state was settled by ex-revolutionary soldiers and their families. So Hot Springs entered into a boom period because all these settlers were streaming through. This was the last town, such as it was. And so they stopped here and they got resupplied. Maybe they took the waters as the spa was open, and basically had their last little touch of Western or of Eastern civilization, really, from the Carolinas and Virginia. Because once you crossed past Paint Rock, 5 miles down the stream, you were in the frontier. There were still Indians around, still Creeks, still Cherokees. And most of the settlements were illegal. A side thing, the French Broad got its name not from what most people think of when they hear the name, but when those first English people came through in the 1780s, I think it was, 1770s, and discovered the place, the first European discoveries. There were 2 rivers in North Carolina in this western part. One ran east and eventually to Charleston, and it was called the Broad River and still is. And then the only other big river was the one that they came into here. And they knew, because it was running west, that it wasn't going to go into the Atlantic. It's on the western continental divide of the East Coast. And so they called it, the French, to demark it from the English Broad River, which ran east into the Atlantic, the French Broad River. So that's supposed to be where the name came from. They knew that the French claimed everything that was in the Mississippi drainage, and this is a part of the drainage of the Mississippi. Boy Scouts every summer put canoes in at Asheville and go all the way to New Orleans on canoes or rafts. It's a big thing to do. That's how you get your eagle, or some do it that way anyway. It takes them 2 or 3 months, and they have to do a lot of portage around all these dams they built in Tennessee. But this river empties into the Gulf of Mexico. So we're really part of the Midwest technically, and not the Eastern Seaboard. In 1831, a man named James Patton, who has a very prominent highway named for him in the middle of Asheville, one of the main streets of Asheville, built and enlarged on the old inn that was here, and built a very, very fancy spa and hotel that was called the Mountain Park, that sort of sets the stage for the next big period of growth in this town. It had 500 rooms in it, if you can imagine that, and they were sometimes filled in the summertime. And he ran the Mountain Park for about 20 years. Then he moved to Asheville, became very famous there, had all kinds of things named after him. And then he sold the place, and when they sold the place, it meant they sold the whole area, because the town pretty much was owned and run by whoever owned the hotel and the spa itself. It was the main business of the town, of course. And it was bought by a family which held it for about 40 years, the Rumbo family, famous family that had come over from Greenville, from East Tennessee. And originally they controlled the turnpike. It was a toll road. And so they made a lot of money on tolls on the Buncombe County Turnpike. We were able to buy the Mountain Park Hotel and all the stuff that went with it.
What was their name?
Rumbo.
Rumbo.
Rumbo. They were from Charleston. There are a lot of French-named people from Charleston. I think they were Huguenots or something. And so they ran it until a decade or so after the Civil War was over. Sunnybank, originally, as I said, was built as a large farmhouse that serviced the hotel. There was no railway here then, so there were like 3 stagecoaches a day came in from Asheville. And so that was the main contact with the world. And so this place, the farm that was here, serviced by growing dairy, eggs, and all kinds of vegetables and pork for this 500-room hotel, which had, by this point, had a large staff and all the things that would go along with that sort of thing. Then the war came, and in the 1860s and 70s, the town was dominated by what happened in the Civil War, as were many places in the South. It was fought over 2 or 3 times. There were skirmishes here. We have a reenactment every summer in July here of one of the big skirmishes. The owner, James Rumbo, of course, enlisted in the Confederate Army and became a colonel and fought at some of the battles up in Kentucky and the western part of Virginia. While he was off fighting in the war, his wife ran this large establishment here. They tried to keep it going. Of course, the war made it almost impossible, but she tried to keep it going. And at one point, she was a very strong woman. At one point, when the Cantrell's Raiders, I think is their name, it was a bunch of federal raiding groups. It was sort of quasi-regular military and quasi just outlanders who raided this part of the Confederacy. And if you cross the border, you're in primarily Union sympathy country in East Tennessee. They tried to break away almost at one point. Mm-hmm. So the whole mountain region was very divided during the Civil War. So when she heard this Yankee raiding band was coming down from Greenville, and we're going to take Hot Springs, she went over, and there was a bridge, there still is a bridge, same place, over the French Broad River. It was wood, of course, and so she set it on fire so that the Yankee raiders couldn't come in and take her town, supposedly. So she became kind of a hero here in that. Later on, she had a granddaughter, and this was Bessie Rumbaugh. But Carrie Rumbaugh, a generation or two later, they still ran the place. The Catholic Church decided to set up a mission here, which they did. And we're here for like 50 years. Didn't have a whole lot of success, but they did some good things. They had an orphanage here and several other things. At one point, even a hostel. And so the Ku Klux Klan decided that these Catholics were unwelcome here and shouldn't be in this part of the country. And so some snake handling pastor probably whipped them up in their enthusiasm. And so they came down, supposedly, from East Tennessee. You always blame your neighbors for things that go on. So they were coming down on their horses one night, and they were going to drive the Catholic priest out of town. And they had a little mission station here by then. But this Rambo daughter had gotten converted by them and had become a Catholic, which is kind of unheard of. They should have been Episcopalians or Methodists or something. But in her ardor, she ran across the bridge on her horse with a horsewhip and drove the very first part of this big bunch of Klansmen coming in their hooded outfits and on horses. And she drove them back, and she said, "You Kluxers, get out of our town." And they turned and fled just because of this one woman's courage, So that's another story about those women. And
that was Carrie or Jesse?
What?
Was that Carrie or Jesse?
This was Bessie. Bessie. And so as we moved on, this place, most of the men in the family that were here either were killed or severely wounded in the Civil War. They were Confederate soldiers. Their women, much like Coal Mountain, that movie which you've all seen, had to run the place and carry on the farm. They did the best they could and kept it going. But after the war, all the governments, county and state, were in control of other folk than the people that had originally been in control around here. So taxes were raised on people who had been part of the Confederacy. And it was one way that a lot of land changed hands in that time. The taxes were raised so much on this place that the three women who were in charge then, and one man who survived the war, couldn't afford to pay them. The springs also went into eclipse during that period of the war, and so they were sold a couple of times and closed most of the time. So the original family was broke and couldn't keep the place. It was sort of a gone with the wind scenario. So they moved to California, still live there, come back occasionally. Their third or fourth generation kids come here about once a year and have a reunion, because they remember they've got these stories about the old house. So the house was sold to what around here we call carpetbaggers, people from the north who had money, who had come down to the south and would buy up things at a cheap price. So a family from Connecticut bought this house in the 1870s, and they renovated it and made it into the way it is now. So physically, that they added to it, changed it in lots of ways, and made it a very Victorian kind of wandering house. And they kept it going as a summer place. They would bring down their friends on the train. They were training people. They made a fortune during the Civil War, running railroad goods for the government and that sort of thing. And so they kept going here for about 20 years. And then there was some kind of a national recession, depression in the 1880s or 1890s. And a lot of wealthy folks lost a great deal of their wealth, and this was one of the families for which that was true. So they sold it to another family from Rhode Island. They ran it as, again, a summer place for their friends, and would come down and stay a month or 2 months, but would close it up in the wintertime. Then in the 1890s, it got in a bad situation in which the family that had owned it from Connecticut and or Rhode Island, I forget which one was there then, had to sell it. So they sold it to a local family. It passed into local ownership once again. And they ran it, lived here, their family ran the place as a boarding house for the next 20 years or so. During this time, the hot springs were sold and rebuilt a couple of times, burned a couple of times, as old spas and resorts tend to do, because everything was made out of wood back then. During this time, missionaries came down the Southern Appalachians from the north to, as missionaries always, to do good. And they did do a lot of good, and they also did a lot of harm, probably. But they started the first school for girls and women here in the town. It's called the Dorland Bell School. There wasn't one in the whole of what is Madison County now. And there were virtually no public schools in this part of North Carolina at that point. They just had not really come into being. So the Dorland Bell School was right down here. It occupied a great part of the town. And the Northern Presbyterian Mission Board poured a lot of money into this area. It started clinics and schools all over the county. And then eventually the need for that school disappeared in the 30s and 40s, and the school was moved to Swannanoa and became what is now Warren Wilson College, a very special, popular, and well-known college. But it started here. And the original buildings are still down here, the Presbyterian Church. It's on the National Historic List for being here so long. So it was a pioneer in terms of women's education for sure. And many of the school teachers of Western North Carolina were trained first here because it was a boarding school. And so girls came from far and near to get an education. It's the only place they could do it. About that same time, Sunnybank, this place, which is named by the original builders of it in 1875, came into the Gentry family. Most commonly, people just say, oh, Jane Gentry's family, because she was such an important character in Hot Springs history, and of course in the history of this house. She ran this as a boarding house for the Dorland Bell teachers and for anyone who wanted to stay in town. There probably wasn't much any other place to stay at this time. This was about the time of the First World War. During the First World War, the whole country was mobilized to fight the Germans. And so the vacation industry, the tourist industry, sort of went into, hyper during that time. It just not much was happening at all. So the Rumbos rented the whole town, except for this place and a few other privately owned places, to the federal government. And it was turned into a massive prisoner of war camp about 1915. And 2,500 German naval officers, and they were all officers that had been captured on the high seas, were brought here and incarcerated down on the grounds of the hotel in the Hot Springs. They put a fence up around it, 100-acre fence. And they stayed here for 3 years until the war was over, and had an interesting interaction and effect on the town, as you might imagine. And there are lots of stories about that one, but I won't go into all those. Then in the 1920s and 30s, the town went into an eclipse. It never the old hotel burned right after the First World War ended, after the prisoners of war left, were sent back to their home countries. And it didn't get rebuilt. It never did get rebuilt. And so the town went into an eclipse, started losing population. It went from a steady, real population of about 2,000 down to 600. Stayed at 600 for the next 30 or 40 years. It's now a little bit more than that, but not much. In the 1920s, one thing I need to mention is, during that World War I period, Cecil Sharp, famous English collector of ballads, came all around here collecting English ballads. He found that the English and Irish ballads that had died out in terms of people's knowledge of them in England, in the home country, were still alive here. And were still being sung the way they were sung 200 years ago. And so the whole ballad tradition, which no one knew much about outside of the Southern Appalachians Mountains itself, he collected for 2 years and published the first collection of ballads and stories called Jack Tales, which you've all know. Jack the Beanstalk being the most famous one. And here in this room, from Jane Gentry, who was the matriarch of this place during that period for about 35 years. He collected over 70 ballads from her, the largest single source. She was known as a song catcher, who is a person who collects ballads. There's a movie been made about her called Song Catcher, which you may have seen, and a couple of books have been written about her. She was an amazing woman. Then in the 30s, the national forests were created, and land was bought up because it was a depression and farmers were leaving and couldn't make a living. The federal government, under Roosevelt and others, decided to buy up as much land as they could and create national forests and preserves and wilderness areas for preservation purposes. So a lot of land around this town was bought and put into what was to become the Pisgah National Forest. And right now, the town is surrounded on 3 sides by Pisgah National Forest. The only side of the town that isn't is the road going down the French Broad River. The little land along that road, 2570 to Tennessee, is still privately owned. And it's done many wonderful things. One of them is kept the town from growing very much. So it stayed a small little southern town because there was the federal government owned all the land around it. So and a lot of people here didn't like that, but it was, most people see it as a blessing and not a curse. But during that same 30s period, the AT idea was born and actually put into practice around here. There was a huge civilian conservation corps camp here for like a couple of thousand CCC workers, and they built the national forest trails, campgrounds, and in some cases roads all around in this area, all the way down to Davenport Gap and up into almost to Irwin. So it was a hotbed of the Civilian Conservation Corps and its work. And it's during that time that the AT was laid out and built. We have a shelter up here, which is in bad shape, but it was built in 1935 by the CCC and the campground. Beautiful rock work. They did some amazing work back then in terms of building structures that have lasted for 75 or 80 years. And so then in 1948, the AT was finished in 1937. The war sort of shut it down almost. With timing?
No, I was saying finished.
Oh, finished. Okay. All right. You can. Anyway, it has several birthday times. One's 1937. I know that because that's when I was finished in a way and got born out into the world. In 1948, Earl Schaefer, the first through hiker ever. You all know Earl Schaefer, who was sort of the Columbus of through hiking. He was the first guy to do it. Came through here. At that point, no one knew what through hikers were, and there wasn't really any other place in town that he could stay easily. So he stayed here in 48, room number 4. I don't know who's in up there. There's a little gold plaque on the door that his foundation let me have. He came back several times. He was here in 98 hiking, his 50th anniversary hike, when he had his 80th birthday on the trail. As you know, I'm sure if you've been around long, you remember that time because it was covered very widely in the news. And the first time a lot of people heard about the AT was when Earl did that 50th anniversary hike. And I think it was supposed to be the 50th anniversary of the trail at that point as well. And for his trailblazing, I think a lot of other people heard about it and decided to do it themselves. And so gradually the number of people hiking the trail got bigger and bigger and bigger to where it is today, which may be too big. We don't know for sure. But I was camping with Boy Scouts in the Great Smokies when I was about 16, and I met a through hiker near Davenport Gap who was hiking the trail, and he told us that night about the trail, the Appalachian Trail. He didn't know that much about it, and that he was going to hike from Georgia to Maine, and we thought that was fascinating. So he planted a seed, and in 1976, when I needed to take a break from the job I was doing living in Durham, I hiked about 4 months and hiked most of the trail, though I skipped Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, and have never, unfortunately, gone back and filled them back in. But I stayed here in 1976 for about 3 nights. And got to know the town and the Gentry family who were running the place then. And they said, well, come back and see us. So, as a lot of people did on the trail then. And so I did over the next 2 or 3 years. And then eventually they said, come back and work with us. So I had decided that I'd rather live in the mountains and in the Piedmont of North Carolina, rather live in a small town than in a large growing town. So I moved back here at the end of 1978. Worked with them. I'd been a cook earlier in my life, ran a vegetarian restaurant in Durham. And so after about 6 months, they said, we're going to retire, go to Georgia and live with our daughter. And we'd like you to take the house and continue on the tradition that we have been carrying on here. So I thought about it, and I had nothing else better to do. So at the end of 1978, I settled in here, and I've been here ever since then. Hundreds, no, probably thousands of hikers, day, section, and through have come through here and stayed here. Early on, we were the only place that was hiker friendly. I'll use that word. The other people still thought hikers were strange individuals, and they weren't sure if they wanted to invite them into their motels or whatever. Luckily, all of that's changed now, as I'm sure you know. Everyone that loves hikers wants them to come in, partly because of this, and partly because there really has been a change in attitude toward hikers. So I've been here. I came back and settled in, and then there was a stream of former hikers, many of them through hikers, who came through here, liked the area, and moved back. About 10% of the population of Hot Springs now are former, I call them long-distance hikers. They weren't all through hikers, but most of the businesses down here, the outfitter store, the cafes, the 3 or 4 whitewater companies are run and staffed by former hikers. Sort of that way in Asheville too, I think now. Maybe not as many because Asheville's so big. But the AT has had an amazing interaction with this town. The town would be very different if it weren't for the AT and its history of coming through here. And I'll tell you one last story, and then I'll stop. When the AT started selling those license plates, I forget what you call them, but you know the ones I'm talking about. Yeah, and a part of that money, or maybe all of it, I don't know, has to go to the state in which the license plates were sold, and has to have something to do with the AT. So we've been a prominent trail town since the beginning, and so we went to that committee and asked for some of that money. And the mayor was a woman at that point, Debbie Ponder, and part of an old political dynasty in this county. And so she got a grant. I don't know what it was, several $1,000s, $3,000 or $4,000, to do something to enhance the trail in the town of Hot Springs. She had a cousin who had just gotten out of school and as an arts person, a sculptor. And so she said, "What would you like to do? We've got all this money, we don't know what to do with it exactly." And so he decided that he thought it would be really nice to have AT symbols carved into what looks like marble, I'm not sure what it really is, and put them along the main street of town. And so we're the only town on the AT, as far as I know, that the sidewalk is almost covered with AT symbols, and all because of our little corruption in our political system here. But it worked, and people appreciate them, and it makes it unique.
And now you have lovely street banners too.
Yes, because we're an official trail. What's that term? Trail?
AT community.
AT community. We have the only monument to Earl Schaefer's first through hike. It's right downtown, in front of the visitor center. If you have time, go see the visitor center. It's a really nice center. It talks a lot about the Appalachian Trail, and it's a great effect on our community. It's made the town much more open, tolerant, and liberal politically than it would have been normally, and as is compared to some of the other small towns around us, like Newport. You know Newport, probably. But so that's about it. We wonder now what the future of the AT is going to be, because it's changed so much, and I hope all you people keep working to keep it a good experience for everybody, both for the hikers and the communities that it goes through.
Thank you.
And I've been an ATC member since 1978. We're glad you're here. So just little housekeeping things. There's going to be coffee and water in the kitchen where you had breakfast, where you got it this morning, all during the day and evening. So if you want to have more coffee or more tea or water, just come in there.
Thank you so much, Elmer.
You're welcome. I'm sorry I rambled on
Stay here with
so
you.
long.
No, it's